Tunde took a deep breath, the scent of home mingling with the warm, earthy breeze. He stood outside the old bus, waving to his family, their faces a mix of pride and worry as they sent him off to the monastery. His younger siblings chatted excitedly, too young to grasp the weight of his journey, while his mother clasped her hands tightly, lips moving in silent prayer. Tunde climbed back into the bus, his heart both heavy and light, a mix of faith and uncertainty filling his chest. Several miles later, the bus made a brief stop along the quiet, winding road. Tunde stepped out to stretch and relieve himself, the towering trees casting long shadows as dusk began to fall. Moving toward the bushes, something glinted at his feet. A worn deck of tarot cards lying half buried in the dirt, edges frayed but the symbols still visible. Curious, he crouched down, lifting the deck carefully, feeling an odd pull as he turned the cards in his hands. Without thinking, he tucked the cards into his bag, a strange thrill fluttering in his stomach as he rejoined the bus, unaware that his innocent curiosity had just set something dark and unholy into motion. As Tunde walked toward the monastery, he felt excited and respectful. The stone building stood tall against the sun, casting long shadows over the courtyard. He could hardly wait to start his duties, show what he could do, and grow in his faith. The monks greeted him warmly, and their calm smiles and kind gestures made him feel at home. He looked around, taking in the simple beauty of the monastery's walls and the soft sounds of prayers from inside. This was to be his new home, a place of peace and devotion. After a simple meal and evening prayers, Tunde settled into his small, austere cell that night. His bag lay by his bed, and he noticed the faint shape of the tarot deck under his folded robe. He hesitated, a strange sense of unease creeping into his mind. He quickly dismissed it, reminding himself that the cards were just a curious memento of his journey. His thoughts drifted to the responsibilities awaiting him in the morning, cleaning, studying, and joining the others in their meditative practices. With a contented sigh, he closed his eyes, blissfully unaware that the darkness lurking in his bag would soon turn his sanctuary into a place of unimaginable horror. Tunde sat on the cold stone floor of his dimly lit cell, looking at the tarot cards he had found. Shadows moved along the walls as the candle flickered, creating strange shapes around him. He held the deck in his hands, feeling the rough edges of the worn cards. Each card had detailed symbols and haunting images. He knew these cards should not be touched. They were seen as superstitious and clashed with his new life in the monastery. Still, something about them captured his attention, as if they were revealing secrets he was not supposed to know. He was curious and carefully pulled a single card from the deck. The image on it seemed to come alive in the candlelight. A figure in darkness with hollow eyes staring back at him. He felt a change in the air and a weight on his chest. He quickly put the card back into the deck, his hands shaking as he returned the cards to his bag. The room went quiet, and the candlelight dimmed momentarily as if the shadows were getting closer. He forced himself to lie down and tried to push away the fear. But the image stayed in his mind as he fell into a troubled sleep. The following day, Tunde awoke with a heavy feeling pressing on his chest, as if a weight had settled over him in the night. Shaking off the uneasy sleep, He joined the other monks in the chapel for morning prayers, hoping a familiar chanting rhythm would soothe his restless mind. Yet, as he knelt, eyes closed in meditation, a faint, foul odor filled the air, sharp and intense, seeping into his nostrils. He opened his eyes, glancing around to see if anyone else noticed. Still, the others appeared undisturbed, immersed in their devotion. Puzzled, he tried to ignore it, but the stench lingered, clinging to him like an invisible shroud. The smell grew stronger throughout the day, and by evening it seemed to permeate the entire monastery. Tunde's unease grew, the memory of the tarot card flashing in his mind, his hollow-eyed figure haunting his thoughts. He told himself it was just a coincidence, perhaps a trick of his imagination. But as he walked the silent corridors at night, he felt an eerie presence, something unseen watching him from the shadows. Once a haven of peace, the monastery now felt tainted, as if an invisible darkness had seeped into its very stones. The stench thickened as he lay down to sleep, a lingering reminder that something had been disturbed and wouldn't leave quietly. That night, Tunde found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with the unsettling events of the day. Driven by an inexplicable urge, he reached for the tarot deck tucked away in his bag, hoping to understand why the air felt so heavy, why he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Lighting a single candle, he sat cross-legged on the floor and spread the cards before him, their haunting symbols seeming to shift in the dim light. His hand hovered over the deck before drawing a card, its surface cool and smooth. He looked down to see a shadowy figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscured, reaching out as if trying to escape the card. Tunde stared at the cards in the dim room. It felt colder, and a whisper echoed off the stone walls, breaking the silence. His heart raced as a shadow in the card flickered, making it seem alive. Then he noticed a faint figure outside the candlelight, blending into the darkness. He blinked, his heart racing, but the figure was gone. Shaking, he quickly put the cards back in his bag. He breathed shallowly as the whisper faded away. When he blew out the candle and fell asleep, he felt the darkness close in, sensing that something had awakened. This presence would not rest until it claimed what he had unknowingly brought into their sacred space. The following day, Tunde hoped to find solace in his daily tasks, immersing himself in the monastery's routines, seeking comfort in the discipline and prayer. But a sense of dread clung to him, stubborn and unyielding. During his chores, he overheard two monks discussing a strange heaviness they felt in the air, and his heart raced as he realized he wasn't the only one sensing it. A glimmer of hope sparkled within him. Perhaps he wasn't imagining things, and maybe he wasn't alone in feeling the disturbance. Yet guilt gnawed at him, for he knew the strange happenings began only after he'd brought the cards into the monastery. That evening, he could not resist and took out the tarot deck again, wanting to find a way to fix what he had done. He drew another card and saw a scary figure in pain, its face twisted in agony. As he looked at it, he felt a heavy weight fill the room. The walls seemed to close in, and shadows stretched toward him, moving strangely in the candlelight. Just when he thought he might run away, the pressure lifted, leaving him breathless. But the silence afterwards was even worse. A cold, empty feeling that felt like someone was watching him. He pushed the cards away, promising to leave them alone. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The following day, the monastery was shrouded in an unnatural stillness, as if the air had thickened with something unseen. Tunde watched the other monks move through their daily prayers and tasks, but a quiet tension paused beneath the surface, a sense of unease that no one dared to acknowledge. As the day wore on, shadows seemed to cling to the monks, following them in ways that defied the sun's movement, as if they had taken on a life of their own. Tunde's heart pounded as he noticed the monks' glances over their shoulders, their eyes darting to empty corners. Sensing what he already knew, they were being followed. When night fell, a true horror began in the monastery. As darkness settled in, ghostly figures appeared from the shadows. Their twisted shapes whispered strange words that troubled the monks' minds, filling them with fear and despair. The once peaceful halls turned into a frightening maze, where every shadow and flicker of candlelight posed a threat. One by one, the monks lost control. Some scratched at their skin to escape the invisible burden, while others muttered prayers that failed to help. Tunde crouched in his cell, heart racing as the whispers grew louder, surrounding him and filling his mind with dread. He covered his ears, but the voices continued invading his thoughts as if digging deep into his soul. He realized with a heavy heart that he had unleashed a nightmare in the monastery. The following day, the monks were left visibly shaken, their faces pale, eyes hollow from a sleepless night, filled with horrors they couldn't understand. Tunde could see the fear etched into each face, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on them. Some tried to rationalize what they'd seen, muttering about nightmares or tricks of the mind. In contrast, others huddled in small groups, whispering prayers for protection. Yet no amount of prayer or routine seemed to dispel the darkness that hung over the monastery. Tunde's guilt intensified, for he knew the cause behind their torment. But his fear of confessing the truth held him back, leaving him trapped between shame and terror. That night, the entities returned, more determined than ever. They moved through the dark halls, slipping into the monks' cells like ghosts. The fear grew more robust. The entities left physical signs, scratching doors and marking the walls with cold, wet stains. Tunde's cell was unsafe. He felt a chill on his shoulder and froze as a cold voice whispered his name. He heard his fellow monks crying out in fear, all facing the same terror. The once peaceful monastery had become a place of despair, with each monk trapped in their nightmare. Tunde sat still, knowing he had condemned them all to this horror. By morning, the monastery looked very different. The monks moved slowly through the chapel, showing signs of fear and exhaustion. Their usual calm and devotion had vanished, replaced by a heavy sense of dread. It felt as if the monastery itself had absorbed their fear. Tunde could feel their pain weighing on him, but he felt too ashamed to speak up. He couldn't tell them that he had caused this darkness. He silently hoped that this horror would end soon, and that things would get better on their own. That night, filled with guilt and desperation, Tunde again reached for the tarot cards. His hands trembled as he drew a card, wishing for a sign or a solution to lift the curse. The card showed a tall figure surrounded by flames, its expression full of pain and anger. As soon as he saw it, the room filled with a suffocating heat, as if an unseen fire had ignited in the walls. The air became heavy and smelled of burning and decay, while shadows moved wildly as if they had a life of their own. Tunde's heart raced as he came to a frightening realization. Each card was a symbol and a way for something dark to enter their world. With each card he drew, he brought doom closer, tying himself and others to the darkness now consuming them from within. The next day, the heat stayed strong, filling every part of the monastery and making the monks suffer as they worked. Sweat dripped from their foreheads and they felt exhausted in every movement. Their spirits were low from the constant, hidden strain. Tunde noticed fear building in their eyes, a quiet wish for help that no one would speak. Even the most faithful monks who had always believed strongly needed help to focus on their prayers. They looked over their shoulders, worried that something terrible would happen. Tunde felt guilty and helpless, his silence tying him to their pain as if under a spell. That night, Tunde lay in his cell with a pounding heart. He heard faint sounds of crying and whispered prayers from outside the walls. He knew he couldn't just sit back any longer. He had to find a way to stop this. Ignoring his better judgment, he reached for the tarot deck again, his hand shaking as he drew a card. This time the card showed a barren, empty landscape with ghostly figures wandering around, their faces showing sadness and loss. The room turned cold, and Tunde felt a deep chill that seemed to reach into his soul. Outside his cell, the monks cried out, their voices filled with pain as if trapped in that lonely place. Tunde realized then that each card wasn't just frightening him, but changing their reality. It twisted the monastery into a reflection of the horrors he had released, leaving everyone stuck in a world of despair. By morning, the monks were visibly broken, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights haunted by unending terror. They moved as though trapped in a waking nightmare, the life drained from their once devout spirits. Tunde watched them, consumed by guilt and horror at what he had brought upon them, yet paralyzed by fear. Every corner of the monastery felt tainted, the sacred space warped by a lingering darkness that twisted the familiar into something grotesque. Even the statues and icons that once brought comfort now seemed to leer at him, their cold eyes accusing as though they knew the truth he carried in silence. Desperate, Tunde ventured to the monastery's library, hoping to find anything that might explain the tarot cards and offer a way to end the suffering. His hands shook as he flipped through dusty old texts, searching for guidance. Finally, buried within a forgotten tome, he found mention of a forbidden ritual, a rite meant to seal away dark forces but requiring a tremendous personal sacrifice. A spark of hope flickered within him, but it was fleeting. The ritual's demands were steep, its success uncertain. Yet he knew he had no choice. As he read the words aloud, committing them to memory, he understood that his only path forward lay in confronting the curse he had unleashed, no matter the cost to himself. As night fell, Tunde prepared himself for the forbidden ritual, his heart pounding with fear and resolve. The instructions he'd read were complex, requiring an unwavering focus and a purity of intent he wasn't sure he still possessed. He gathered the few items needed: a candle, a handful of salt, and a relic from the chapel, and arranged them on the floor of his cell. The air around him felt heavy, charged with a dark energy that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Every shadow seemed alive, watching him, waiting. Tunde took a deep breath, whispering a prayer as he began the ritual, his voice trembling with each word. As he chanted, a cold chill filled the room. He felt a heavy weight pressing down on him, as if the darkness was fighting back against his efforts to push it away. The shadows around him twisted and moved, and whispers filled the air, making fun of him. These whispers grew louder with each repetition of the chant. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he pushed on, his voice becoming louder and more frantic. Just when he sensed a slight hope, a force suddenly knocked him back, blowing out the candle and leaving the room in darkness. Tunde lay on the floor gasping. He realized the ritual had failed and angered the dark entities more. His heart sank as he understood that he had drawn an even darker force into the monastery, shattering any hope he had left.